Hello and welcome back to another episode of Fully Books, the Hidden Gems author podcast in which Craig Touch and myself, Roland Hume, chat some of the interesting figures and leading lights of this crazy industry of writing and self-publishing. And today we are delighted to welcome a very special guest, Cara Stevens, who is an editor and a book coach and a writer. And she's going to tell us about something called Zero Draft, which I am so excited to hear about. But first of all, Cara, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Oh, we're delighted to have you. Where are you calling in from, by the way?
I'm in Los Angeles. I am sitting in my new outdoor office. We just downsized from like living in the suburbs to having an apartment in the city. And I'm just so happy and thrilled to be sitting outside and do interviews out here.
That is so cool. And of course, we wouldn't be here without the man himself, Craig Touch, the owner and founder of Hidden Gems and an author himself. How are you doing today, Craig?
Doing great. Thank you, Roland, and thanks for coming on, Cara. Yeah, it's great. You're in Los Angeles, which is where we had the guest last week from. And during that interview, there was an earthquake. So hopefully, hopefully that doesn't happen again. I'm pretty sure we're not cursed. That was the first one. So yeah, I'm excited because I don't know much about the zero draft. I know about, the first draft. I know about the second draft and all the drafts that you have to do, but I haven't heard of the zero draft. So I'm looking forward to discussing that with you. But first, why don't you just tell us a bit about yourself and what you do and how you got all into this, and then we'll go from there.
Absolutely. Yeah, I have been writing freelance and professionally since the 90s. So last millennium. I've been doing this a long time. Mostly what I've done up until the past, say, 10 years was writing licensed children's books. So anytime there's a character like Mickey Mouse or Dora the Explorer, I write the books. Just did a Mean Girls book coming out next week. It's the Little Golden Book of the Mean Girls. So it's kind of a collector's edition. And then the past few years, I have discovered an amazing passion that I'm just so excited to share, which is I'm helping people who have a dream of becoming a writer and writing their first book make that dream come true through coaching them and editing and helping guide them through the process.
That's awesome. So, sorry, license. So, the person who owns the license would hire you to write the children's book about whatever the IP is?
Most of the time, I work closely with Nickelodeon. I've worked with Disney, Sesame Street, the Seuss Foundation. But other times, a publisher comes to me and says, "Hey, we bought the rights. We see that you do this, and would you like to write this for us?"
Oh, that's really cool. That's why you're in Los Angeles. I guess it's much easier to be close to all those guys. So tell us about the zero draft. What is that?
So the zero draft is a way to help get yourself unstuck when you're writing. A lot of people write what's called a discovery draft, which is when you're a pantser or you write by the seat of your pants. You're basically just sitting down and you discover the story as you're writing it. But other people are planners and they will plan out the story and they will write the first draft based on a plan. The zero draft is different because it can happen at any point in the writing process. A zero draft is you sitting down and telling yourself the story. It's not reader focused, it's not reader facing. There's no craft to it. It's just you reminding yourself of what you need to say in order to get your story out. So it's not good. It's a crappy first draft, but it's a zero draft, meaning no one's ever going to see it but you.
I mean, Neil Gaiman was the chap who said that the first draft is you telling yourself the story. So I kind of like that. It fits really nicely into that idea.
Absolutely, yes. That definitely was one of my inspirations for making sure that all new writers hear about it. I think there is so many pieces of advice that float around. Everybody's reading, Stephen King's On Writing, and everybody's reading Neil Gaiman's advice, and there's been a master class, and you guys promote so much great information on your podcast. I learn from you each time I listen to it. But I think that sometimes you just need to hear something fresh or in a fresh way, in a way that it speaks to you. So I always think of it as like you're a firefly and you're shouting, you're flashing out your message. And sometimes people are on that frequency and they can hear it and they can see it. And other times they're just not in a place to see it. So, telling as many people as I can about a zero draft, some people will hear it, some people might not be ready. And the process just keeps going.
So Gaiman said that it was the first draft was you telling yourself a story, but this is the zero draft. But it doesn't really come before the first draft because you said it could come at any point. So this is sort of like you would put down the book if you've already started writing it and just go and you do this whole different thing where you just tell yourself the story to get it all straightened out in your head. If you've already started it and you're sort of like muddling through and trying to figure out what's going on. Is that what you're saying? Like you at that point put this down, you don't know what's going on, you've got to start the zero draft where you're just like, okay, this is what the story is, and then you can use that to go back to your one that you've stopped and sort of continue knowing where you're going now.
Absolutely. There's a way to do it in the beginning before you've even written your draft. There's a way if you're sitting in the messy middle, or what I like to call the muddle, and you have no idea where to go next, or you've forgotten what you've done, or you don't know where you're going, or you're trying to find a path to get to where you want to end up. At any point in the process, you can also do it after you've written the entire manuscript. So once you've written the entire manuscript, before you start editing, if you haven't done a zero draft yet, that's when I recommend just sitting down, writing the story from beginning to end. So at some point, I feel like everyone should have a zero draft, just to keep it clear in their mind what they want to say and what the beginning is, and if the end point circles back, and if it feels like a cohesive whole and everything follows.
If you've already written the whole story, though, it would seem to me, and maybe this is just the way my brain works, that if I went and wrote a zero draft, I'd probably be telling myself the story I just wrote, because I'd maybe be trying to, I'm trying to think about whether I'd be doing anything different. And I guess if I did, then that's when you sort of say, oh, maybe I should have written it this way or that way. But I feel like my brain would sort of like automatically try to make me conform to what I just wrote to justify that I did it right.
Absolutely. To me, a zero draft is anywhere between 5 and 10 pages. So whether you have a children's picture book manuscript that runs 3 pages at most if it's condensed, or you have a 350-page novel, you're basically just getting the events down. You're just saying, this is where we begin, this is what happens next, this is what happens next, and just getting the elements in there, really sort of getting the meat down so that you know what your framework is. It's like if you're whether you're building a new building or whether you're repairing a building, scaffolding really helps. And I think of the zero draft as a scaffold, where it's sitting there supporting the structure in a way that you can then edit the center of it. And then once you take away the scaffolding, it will stand so much more steadily, and it will be able to stand on its own.
I think it feels like there'd also be some other uses for it afterwards. Like I'm thinking about, when you go to write your blurb, a lot of times when authors write a blurb, they get a little too overwhelmed with the entire book, and they start putting in too much extra information. And if you had that sort of down to the bones description of 3 to 5 pages, it would be easier to use that to work from. Or if you're hiring somebody to write a blurb, you could give them that, and then they would be able to work from that, and they wouldn't get so stuck in all the minor details that aren't important to the blurb but were important to the story itself.
Absolutely. That's a great way to look at it. You can really get into the weeds when you're telling a story that you've been living with for 6 months to many years, and having that zero draft gets just the meat and potatoes out. It's just saying, here's the story, and then you'll be able to tease out the themes, the most important themes. I think you're going to be able to discover things from the zero draft as well. Once you have it put down, you discover connections, you discover ways of looking at the story that you hadn't realized, themes that you put in, a way to bring it back to the beginning in sort of a chiastic story structure where your ending reflects the beginning and it comes full circle. That's a great way to make sure that your structure is holding. And it's a great way to tell people what your story is about, whether it's a blurb or promotional material or helping you get your elevator pitch down when somebody says, hey, I hear you're writing a book. What's your book about? And you can't just say, wow, let me tell you, and then go on for a full 10 minutes. You just want to give them those 3 or 4 sentences, and it's much easier to blurb that out when you're used to making it smaller and smaller.
I mean, that's a phrase people use, isn't it? Discovery writing, which is where you kind of like, you go on a journey of discovery with your writing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I always call it being a pantser. But a lot of people, when, on Medium, I have a column every week, and I get called out by people saying like, well, you're talking about plot and plotting your story. And, what if you're a discovery writer? And I'm like, you're also still a pantser. You're still going by the seat of your pants, figuring it all out. At some point, you have to look at your story and make sure it works. That's what the discovery draft is for. Like the 0 draft, discovery draft, finding your story, however you want to put it. It's a nice way to sort of see what let's put it this way. A lot of times when you're writing, you get into a flow and your subconscious just kind of keeps going. And you don't even know, like when you're in the zone, you're just like, oh my God, I'm a genius. And then after an hour, you just sit back and you're like dazed. You're like, I don't even know what I wrote. And you go back and discover that you have tapped into something, a theme or a way to make a connection. The reason it works so well for you is because it is tapping into that theme. When you're writing a 0 draft, it's kind of a way to, whether you've plotted something and gotten into the weeds, or you've plotted something that doesn't fit and tie in, or whether you've just gone on this amazing discovery rant and put something in, a 0 draft is a great way to figure out whether you've gone on a side quest or whether you've taken a different path that you could keep going on.
Do you ever go back to edit that 0 draft later if you've, once you started writing and things inevitably sort of veer off as characters find a new voice and maybe a new adventure to go on? Would you then go back to your 0 draft and edit it?
People can, if they feel like it's helping them. I think especially if you're writing a 0 draft in the messy middle of it and you haven't gotten to your end yet. When I'm working with authors and they've given me like the first half of the book and we've gone through it in the first half and they're going to start writing it forward from there once they get unstuck, we talk a lot about changes they can make. And I say, please don't go back and make those changes in your manuscript. Number one, you don't know if they're going to work. And number two, you're just going to get stuck polishing the beginning, and it's almost like, putting in all the bathroom fixtures and screwing in the light bulbs before you've built the rest of the house. So if you've written half the book and you've talked about it and you've created a 0 draft of the first half of the book and even a 0 draft of the whole thing, if you haven't finished writing it, finish writing first. And then if it helps you to go back and change that, then that's a way to go. Or if you're stuck in the messy middle and you write a 0 draft and realize where you've gone wrong and you want to change the beginning, you can actually change the beginning of the 0 draft and write from there. And then when you edit, you can actually have, oh, wait, I didn't realize they were supposed to be here, and kind of bring that back there.
So you have to branch off rather than changing something there and then you continue going, because I guess at that point in the future, you're like, oh my God, what did I do? This doesn't make any sense because of this thing I changed.
Exactly. I think a lot of editors recommend just putting in a note on your manuscript, just saying, change this is what really happens here, or merge these 2 characters, and just keep going forward, just onward. Always keep going forward and don't edit till you're done. Even if you have a 0 draft that means you've changed your premise, just move on, go forward, and then go back and edit it later.
Yeah, it's very easy to get stuck in an endless loop of editing. It's something that I always had problems with, where I'd be like going back and rewriting the first chapter and then later go back and rewrite it again. And it's like I needed to just say, move forward, do that once at the end, especially because, things change and then they change again and then they change again. And until you know sort of the ending and you get all the way through it once, there's no point in continuing to go back after every single new thought you have. ADD makes it a little harder for me. But yeah, I totally agree. So the zero draft doesn't necessarily have to be the whole story from beginning to end. It sounds like you could write, the first half zero draft and then go or whatever.
I think if you've been plotting your story and you get to the middle of the zero draft and you still don't know how it ends, that's when you start doing some deep work and figuring it out. But once you have your zero draft down, then you don't go back and fix it. But the zero draft is it's made for, so you don't have to keep going back and nitpicking and changing things, and you end up with a quilt that has way too many stitches in it, or like a Frankenstein's monster where you're patching things up and it doesn't really get cohesive. So for the most part, if you're writing a zero draft, you tell yourself the story from beginning to end. So you don't want to stop in the middle. You just have to write it to the end before you move on to the next phase.
I mean, that makes more sense to me. It's the ending that most people get stuck on, I think, to begin with. And if you haven't figured that out, it's a lot easier to write yourself into a corner and not have a good ending that makes sense. And you end up with one of those, and then it was all a dream, because you can't think of how to end it.
Exactly. I think I read a great piece of advice when I was in the business world, and we were setting up meetings, and I had this great mentor, and he said, when you're getting into a meeting, begin with the end in mind. So know what you want to accomplish by the end of the meeting before you even walk in. And I've taken that into book editing and writing, that if you're going to start a story and you're really working on a manuscript, even if you're doing a discovery draft or a discovery writing, at some point you need to know the ending before you go back and edit and before you polish. I think that many people mistake the zero draft for a first draft, which is not reader focused and reader facing. And many people, and I have done this as well, and many people mistake a discovery draft as, well, I've just been writing by the seat of my pants and I've written this and now here it is for you to read. And it's not fair to the reader. And I think that one of the things that many of us forget and many of us miss is that when we're writing a story or telling a story, we're forgetting about our audience, that it's definitely a conversation when you're writing. You need to know who's reading it. You can't stand over their shoulder and explain things to them. So you have to make sure you get it clear. And you can't tell them what your goal was and have them know the secrets. So everything has to be there for your reader, and you're offering it to them. So you can't expect things of your reader that you haven't given them the tools to understand or figure out for themselves. You don't want to make it hard for them. You want to make it enjoyable for them to figure out what you're saying or what you're trying to say.
Yeah, I think that's one of the key things, is the idea that it's author focused. So you're telling yourself the story, which means you don't have to worry about spoilers or things that you're foreshadowing. And if you're doing the first draft, you're trying to sort of put those things in and be thinking about them. And then you might forget them, or you might whatever. So with the zero draft, it sounds like easier. So you can write in stuff about you say what's going to happen, but you might put a little note saying, but the reader won't know this, or something like that, so that you don't forget, or that when you go to draft, you see that and you're like, okay, I write with that in mind. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me.
Absolutely. And you touch upon a great point, that the beginning needs to have the seeds for what the ending will grow. Like, you plant the seeds in the beginning, and by the end, those seeds will blossom into full understanding. So if you're going to be planting zucchini in the beginning because that's what you think your story is about, but by the end you have, pea flowers, you have to go back into the beginning of your story to replant the right seeds in order to know what grows. I don't know if that's a weird metaphor. I was just thinking about planting the seeds, and that somebody has a secret long lost twin that will come in at the end. You should know that in the beginning, and you could tell yourself that. You can feel like this is a safe space for you to tell yourself that, and then you can drop hints. It's like Chekhov's gun, where if you put a gun in the first scene, it has to go off by the end of the scene. You want to plant that gun where you need it in order for the ending to make sense.
And that's what really makes a satisfying book, isn't it? When the ending just feels like right and it pays off everything that's come before it.
It has to be surprising and inevitable.
Yes.
And that's so hard to do, but wow, when it hits, you're like, yes, I didn't know that I knew that was going to happen, but that's exactly the right way this should end.
Yeah, I love that. That's surprising but inevitable. When you're writing the zero draft, are you giving yourself sort of like notes about those things if you've thought about them? Like, you put a little note, place a hint about this here or something, or is this just, you tell yourself the story and that's it?
Yeah, don't leave anything out. You're telling it to yourself. You're placing little reminders for yourself.
Right. Okay.
As many breadcrumbs as you can put so that you can follow that trail when you're rewriting or editing or finishing your story. When I do a lot of picture book editing, a lot of first-time picture book authors come to me and say, hey, I've written a book. And what they've done is written a zero draft or just written an idea. Some people come to me with, hey, I have a picture book for you to edit. And it's like 6 sentences. And I'm like, good start. Let's write a zero draft. Or if they've come to me with a zero draft, I'm like, this is great. Why don't you tell me in fewer words, beginning to end, what happens in this story? And then we start making it reader focused, especially with children's books, but really with any audience. You need to write reader facing content, and it's not the same thing as giving yourself hints and planting these seeds. And you're shortchanging yourself if you don't leave those breadcrumbs, because you're going to forget later. You think you're not going to forget, but you do.
Yes, I always have that. I always think to myself, I'll remember that. I know better. I know better. But
absolutely. And I think that, for you guys, like as writers, I think people who have spent a lot of time writing are the best editors and the best people to talk about it, to host podcasts, to write articles, because it's not just that we're working on the theory or that we've read a lot about it. It's that we've really experienced it, where, suddenly you're stuck in the messy middle or the muddle and you have to figure out where to go. You've been there. And so you know how to help somebody through. You've already gone there so you could reach down and help up the next person. So, Craig, you were saying that you've definitely been in some of these situations, and that's what makes you a great host, because you're thinking about that process when you're interviewing and when you're talking about the process.
Well, thank you. I definitely a lot of times hear from people talking about something that they're good at, that they're experts at, and I think to myself, that was something I did wrong. And I learn, and it's great because I am learning from it, which is why another reason why we love doing this is just, it's helpful for us too. I'd never heard of the zero draft before this. So to me, as soon as you mentioned that, and when we were talking before, I was like, yeah, that's what we want to talk about, because that's not something that I know about, which doesn't mean that no one else knows about it, but it means that, if I don't know about it, then there's probably others that don't know about it. And so, this is one of those cool things that people will want to learn about. So I guess, do you have sort of tips about how you go about writing a zero draft? Is it just stream of conscience, just tell yourself there's nothing to it, just tell yourself the story, try to keep it somewhat short, 3 to 5 pages, or is there some tips to it?
For me, I like the stream of consciousness method, and if I get stuck, I go for a walk, listen to music. A lot of people have routines, like you light a candle before you write, so that every time you sit down, you have that scent and that ritual in your mind, so you get into the zone of the story. But then again, there is one method that I've fallen in love with, which is Randy Ingermanson's snowflake method. Have you heard of this?
Oh, I have heard of that, but I would love you to distill it down.
I love it. When I discovered it, I was like, yes, this is it. And, Craig, as you're saying, like, we hear about things and share them, we're passing it along. A lot of people haven't heard of the zero draft, or they have heard of it like through the way Neil Gaiman talks about it. The snowflake method is basically based on fractals. So you have a one sentence description of your story, and then you can make it bigger on a page. So write a sentence, then write a paragraph, then write a page, then write a scene by scene outline. And as you're discovering your story, you can make it bigger and bigger. And then he goes into writing character sketches, or trees to connect your characters, or following a plot arc and things like that. You can go as deep as you want into his snowflake method. But for the most part, it's really just you start with a sentence, and then you can go into a paragraph and then a page. And it is like a fractal. It just gets bigger and bigger, but it's the same story.
And do you recommend doing your zero draft in one sitting? Like, in my mind, as we're talking about this, to me, it would make the most sense to do it in one sitting. But depending on how complicated things are, how well thought out the whole thing is in your head before you start, that's probably not always possible. But I know, like, often, I when I was writing, it was different, because I was writing, every day, as opposed to now when I write, it's snatches of time here and there. So I find I often have to, if there's a period in between of writing sessions, then I got to take all this time to reread what I did and figure out what I had planned and this and that. So to do things in multiple sittings with time periods in between, there's all this like having to get caught up, and then my brain's in a different place and this and that. So it would be easier if I push forward and do it all in one sitting. But I think that unless you have it all sort of planned out in your head, that might be difficult. So what are your thoughts on that?
I agree. I think that there's part of it that's a discovery. I think the zero draft comes when you know where you want to start, where you want to end, and then you can figure out how you want to get there. But I think you need a picture of your story in your mind. So you can start writing the first draft where it's a little bit meandering. And I think that the zero draft comes when it's a little bit more solidified about where you start, where you end, and how you want to get there. So it's not necessarily the first draft. That sometimes you need to do a little throat clearing, or I remember even back in college and university, when you write a paper, I would always throw out the first paragraph or the first page, because it's just clearing my throat, organizing my thoughts. And then somewhere down the line, it's like, oh, that's where I have to start. So a lot of it is discovering your story first. And that's not the zero draft. It's not discovering the story. It's writing down what you know about it and having a picture of beginning, middle, end. So when you get stuck in the messy middle, you start with what you know. And if you're still stuck, that's the time to take a walk, or talk it out with somebody, or even talk it out with your dog, just to say, or like pretend you're being interviewed about it, and just stand in front of a mirror and be like, oh, well, Craig, here's what I was thinking is going to happen here, and discover it, and then write the zero draft. So it lets you know where you're stuck.
So really, you have to have a North Star first. You have to have, like, this is where we're going. This is where we start off. Maybe you've got some idea of some points on the way. But yeah, apart from that, I guess it is discovering the path there. But you have to know where you're going.
I love that. Yes, you need a North Star. I'm totally going to steal that, Roland. That's fabulous. Exactly. Knowing your point before you start speaking is always a good idea. Knowing your point before you start writing your zero draft, having a sense of the beginning and ending.
So if you ever get to the point, because I mean, I've noticed whenever I've tried to pantsing, the problem is you can go through some of the things, and then you're like, oh, I'm at this point here, I need to get this point here, but you have writer's block, which often comes from it doesn't make narrative sense. The way you've got the character to this point will not take them to this point. And so how do you deal with that when you're in the zero draft stage?
That's a great question. And that messy middle, I cannot tell you how many novels I have started in the past that get to page 63 or 64. And I will tell you, it's always page 63 or 64. And I don't know what, I'm just like, oh, I know where I want to end up, but it's the fun and games part of like, regular life and getting the characters to do what you want. Sometimes it means you haven't fully developed the characters. Sometimes it means that you don't know their motivation. Not to make a pitch, but that's where a book coach comes in, or a writing group, or somebody. I have somebody. My friend Brenna, we meet every week, whether we have something to talk about or not. And for an hour and a half, we split the time, and I talk about my work in progress. She talks about hers. And just even talking about it can help you get through it. But you're not ready to write a zero draft, a real true zero draft, unless you know what that bottom third of the story is going to be about. If you have a big blank spot where it's like leading up to a joke, and then you're like, and then something funny happens, and then everybody laughs. You need to know what the something funny happens is and make sure that it's funny before you write your zero draft.
I like that. So there are concrete details you need to have in there to make sense.
Exactly.
I also like what you were saying about, taking a walk and stuff. I mean, I think this is something that people who aren't writers don't get. My wife is always like, well, you're a writer. Why are you doing the washing up, doing something this? Why aren't you writing? And it's kind of like, because I do my best writing when I'm doing my washing up, listening to the soundtrack, percolating the ideas in my head. And then the time spent actually writing is just like downloading from my brain onto the page. And
exactly. It's just that download. And that's when your brain is on fire and it comes out through the keyboard and you don't know even what you've written at that point. You're just like, whoa, I did that. How did I do that? It's like, you did it because you were washing up and because you were listening to a soundtrack. And absolutely, I've led classes with kids through Writopia, and then we had writing workshops at a local library. And I would give the kids the opportunity of what to play, and they would always choose either video game soundtracks or movie soundtracks, because they were all about a journey. Like the video game soundtrack is, you're going from place to place and it reminds you of that journey. And so you sort of can feel the story structure in your head. And then movie soundtracks, the first writing group I ever had, all they wanted to listen to was How to Train Your Dragon soundtrack, which I never would have thought, but it's this very big classical score that's really got a lot of suspense. And they did their fastest and best writing when they were writing along to somebody else's ebb and flow of a story. That was really helpful as well.
Yeah, I think it relaxes your brain. And for me, like I get my best sort of creative ideas when I'm trying to go to sleep. So, I think it's relaxed. My brain relaxes. I stop worrying about different things, and then maybe it just starts focusing on, I don't know, creativity or something. But it's why I can never sleep. So then, I need to sort of like what you're saying, download. I need to put it into my phone, grab my phone from the nightstand and type it in. Otherwise, it'll keep spinning in my head, probably for fear of forgetting it. But once I can download it, once I can pop it down on to something, then I can quiet my brain. But, in the shower, I come up with ideas. Like it's always when I'm not really at the computer. At the computer is the time to take those things that I came up with at other times and sort of flesh them out. But the actual creativity of it usually comes at very awkward times.
I have a theory about those shower thoughts and the ideas that come while you're driving. I think that they're thought nuggets. And I think that when you have them, you're like, oh my God, this is the most brilliant idea ever. But they're just seeds and they haven't fully sprouted. So if you forget them when you sit down to write, it probably means that they haven't fully sprouted yet and you don't really know what they're going to become. So you keep thinking about it, you keep doing the washing up, and you keep, waking up in the middle of the night with new ideas, or just, I call it marinating or ruminating. A cow has several stomachs, so they eat, they send it to the stomach, it comes back up, they send it to the stomach. And I think that a lot of ruminating is that sort of taking a nugget and digesting it a few times before it's a fully formed thought. So, next time you have a thought before you go to sleep and you don't remember it in the morning, it's totally okay, because it's still growing in there and it will come back out in the right way when it's time. That's my feeling anyway. If that makes you feel better about losing those little jolts of inspiration in the shower or when you're driving.
Yeah, I mean, they might come back. I'm never sure if they will, if I forget, or it could be some new thing. Who knows what I've forgotten? All the amazing things I've forgotten. But yeah, I think that makes sense. And I think for the most part, it is your brain needs to sort of chew on things for a while and then sort of present it to you in more of a conscious way. And maybe in the subconscious, it's not fully formed. It doesn't feel like you're going to respect it enough. So it waits until it's really able to present its best self. Maybe that's how it works.
Yeah, that's why we dream in metaphors, because we're just processing, putting things into their place. And then when we wake up, we're able to somehow grok it to get it out into the world. No one's ever created a good substitute for the word grok that Heinlein created.
I'd only heard the word
Mars
grok
book?
in the context of AI, because the Twitter's AI is called Grok. So tell me about grok, the origin of the word grok.
Oh, I love this. Okay, so Robert A. Heinlein was a science fiction writer, and he came up with a whole bunch of really cool words, and all the science fiction writers did. So, like, he created Waldos, which are right now used in surgery to be like robotic hands, but he was the one who called robotic hands Waldos. So Grok was the book about Mars, which I can't remember. I'm sure
sorry, the book about Mars was the Martian.
Was it the Martian Chronicles?
Oh wait, sorry, no, Robert. I'm
no.
Got Andy War, so
Right.
Andy Weir.
Oh yeah. Oh, that was such a great book. Okay.
I'm reading here. It says the informal verb grok was an invention by Heinlein, whose 1961 novel *Stranger in a Strange Land* placed great importance on the concept of grokking.
So an alien comes down from Mars, and their way of completely not just understanding something, but putting it into their consciousness and making it part of like a bigger understanding of something is grokking. And it's just a great way to think about even a zero draft. Is when you can really grok your story, that's when you write your zero draft. Whether it's in the beginning, in the middle, or after the end, you've got to grok your story in order to have a zero draft that really encapsulate what it's about.
I love that. I think that's a great way of putting it.
I love playing with words.
So how did you stumble across this as a method? What is your path towards writing? When did you start writing? What methods did you used to use? Where did you realize that they needed work?
That's a great question. I have been a pantser my whole life. And for NaNoWriMo, National Novel Writing Month in November, I started writing novels every year, got really involved, with the writing community. And I realized I was getting stuck in the messy middle every single time. And so I did a lot of studying, listened to Neil Gaiman's talks and master classes, and it all just sort of, I realized that I didn't know enough to finish my story. And that's where the zero draft came in. I started using it a lot when I was editing people's picture books, where people would come to me with a story that was all over the place or not fully formed, or didn't really have a main character who had agency. Like a lot of times you have a child who's a main character and the parent tells them what to do and then it has a happy ending. But with a picture book, especially, everything is so much shorter and more encapsulated story-wise. So it's easier to see the elements that go into a good story. It's easy if somebody says to me, okay, here's my story from beginning to end. And I said, so what does your main character do in order to grow or change? What did they do? What decisions do they make? What understandings do they come to? And so it sort of grew into, okay, let's do a zero draft that really works before you write your next draft of the manuscript. And that's when I realized that it wasn't just picture book writers, it wasn't just the novels that I was writing, it was everybody could really use. It's more than a summary, it's more than an outline. It's got those seeds in it, and you don't have to tell anybody else what's happening except for you. Like if you have an outline, you're not going to have that hint that the sister's brother's cousin's husband's uncle is going to come in at the last minute and know all of these things and have, so you need to plant those seeds in the beginning in your version of it, and it's just for you. So I sort of came across it not just with my own NaNoWriMo journey where I couldn't finish my story and I was halfway through the month and I was like, well, what do I do now? So I looked back and I was like, I don't really know who my main character is. Like, I know what situation she's in. And I sort of started to see the holes in it once I started to see the story. And it wasn't until I just stream of consciousness wrote what would happen in the end that I was able to then, in my next draft, go back to the beginning and rewrite and finish a book.
I find that fascinating. I mean, the path that getting a book finished is the most important thing. It's what makes or breaks it. And I think so many writers have so many great ideas and they want to write and they start the book and it doesn't go anywhere. I mean, I've got a book right now that's been languishing for months because you're not quite sure where it's going. So yeah, having a technique to lead you out of it is a really nice one. And the thing I like about this is there's not so much pressure on you as you have when you have to plot things out. I'm big on like plotting books. I like the story circles and things like that. But if you are a pantser by nature, doing something like that is kind of like the antithesis of how you work. And I know, yeah, a lot of writers get resentful at the idea of like, oh, now I have to sit down and plot it. Then it takes the magic out of it. And so this seems to be a way to be able to ride that magic while at the same time making progress towards completing your story.
Yes, I love that. Absolutely. Absolutely.
So you think this is acceptable to pantsers to do a zero draft, and that doesn't count as plotting to them?
I think that plotting rankles many discovery writers or pantsers. But yeah, if you just say you're not plotting, you're just sit down and like think about it, and they're like, oh, I can sit down and think about it. Like, I think it's a gentle way. Like, for people, many writers don't like structure. It's just sort of, it's part of being a creative. It's like, structure, what's that? So you don't need the structure. You just need to like take what's in your brain and throw up a little bit on the page, and then you have something to work with. Because when it's in here, it's all in a jumble, and you've got your metaphors and you've got things you sort of know. But until you start writing, it needs to be real and tangible before you can start massaging it. You can't sculpt something with clay without having the clay.
I like that. Throw up a little on the page. I really like that. That's something I'm going to steal as a. And then, well, we are approaching the top of the hour, top of the psychiatry chat. But I think that's a great place to like pause and wrap things up. But before we ask you to share with our audience where they can find out more of your stuff, I have a final question. If anyone's listening to this right now and it's gelling with them, what is your advice to them as the next immediate step that they can take this afternoon to go and make something happen?
Ooh, okay. Well, I think just telling yourself the story, even just doing that snowflake way, and get a sentence down what your story is about, then get a paragraph, and then get a page down, and really encapsulate and see if you understand what your story is. And if you don't, it's totally okay. It's actually great because it's all part of the process. And everybody is at different places in the process. You have to go from knowing nothing to knowing everything. So being able to write down in one page what your story is about is part of that process.
I love that. Well, that's brilliant. So, okay, everybody who's been listening to this and thinks what you're telling them is mind blowing, where can they go, Cara, to find out more about you and more about what you do?
My website, carajstevens.com. And also on Medium, I have a weekly column in the Writing Cooperative. It comes out every Tuesday, and it's called Writegeist. And I discover the art, craft, and spirit of writing along with my readers.
Well, we will definitely pop a link to your website down below. So if you're listening to this, you've enjoyed what Cara has to say, scroll down, give that link a click, and go and check her stuff out. While you're there, you'll pass, of course, that big, long, blank comment section. So why don't you leave Cara a comment and let her know how much you've appreciated what she shared with us today. Craig, do you have any final thoughts, questions?
No, I mean, this has been, like I said, this is fascinating to me. I love hearing about new things that I hadn't heard about before. And to me, this gels really well because I like the idea of, I've heard that the idea of telling yourself the story as your first draft, but but then it's kind of like it's different, right? Because you're writing the whole draft and you're sort of I like the idea of having something that's much shorter where you're telling yourself and you're not worrying about sort of those spoilers. And because I find that I've done that before where I start writing out stuff and then I'm like, well, I shouldn't write that, so then I got to write a little note somewhere that says go back and do it. So I like the idea that you know, with this kind of a zero draft thing, I can put all that down and then refer back to it when I need to keep myself on track. So thanks for coming on and going through all this and introducing me, at least, to this concept, and hopefully to some of our listeners as well.
I'm so glad that it gelled with you. Thank you so much for having me on and giving me the opportunity to talk about it with you guys and explore and learn more about, you know, again, it's sort of giving me more information now that I can share with others as well. So thanks for asking those great questions to help me sort of define the process even more fully.
Oh, well, it's been delightful to have you. Make sure that you hit the like button so Cara knows how much you appreciate what she shared. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. And then there is, of course, a little bell icon. You could click on that and you will be notified every time there is a new episode of Fully Booked. And there will be a brand new episode of Fully Booked coming out next week. So stay tuned. Thank you very much.